This is the United States, and this is the greater United States. When you think of America, you think of a nation built to fight empires. It started that way. But here's the twist. What if, despite all that, it's quietly built the strongest empire in the current world? In this video, we're asking, is the US really an empire? The definition of an empire, which I established in my last video, was a power that rules over many places and groups of people, each with their own culture, and spreads influence beyond its original borders. From the beginning, the US was against empires. Its origin started fighting one. In 1775, the American Revolution started, a war aimed to end oppression from an empire. This puts America on a side of history which is pretty clear: anti-imperialism. However, look what happens right after the US gets independence. America expands west with a promise: manifest destiny. This promise slowly turns the US away from its origin, a country fighting empires, and slowly morphs into becoming one itself. In this video, I'm not going to explain how this expansion came to be, but I really recommend looking into it. But I want to make it clear. This expansion by itself could already be considered imperialistic. But this is just the start of this empire. The year is 1898. On another important island in the Caribbean, Cuba.
Throughout Cuba, 2 million voters.
Cuba had been fighting for independence since 1895. The US had been looking at the war, trying to find an excuse to join in and help Cuba with its independence. And on February 15th, 1898, they got their excuse. A mighty explosion sank the Maine. 260 crew members were killed. Even though responsibility wasn't determined, the US public held Spain accountable. Look at this political cartoon. It says, "Remember the Maine." It's missing the second half of the rally, which said, "To hell with Spain." The United States recognized the independent government in Cuba to provoke Spain, which worked, as on April 24th, they declared war upon the United States. Congress declared war on April 25th. Remember, at this point the United States just wanted to help, not conquer. But the moment the war broke out, the United States didn't just go after Spain in Cuba. Suddenly, Washington was launching attacks on every major Spanish possession it could reach: the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. And by July 1898, 11,000 American troops arrived at the Philippines and took over the capital. Cuba also fell in 1898, shortly after the Treaty of Paris was signed. In it, Spain ceded Puerto Rico and one of the Mariana Islands to the United States, and it was determined that the United States would hold on to Manila until the position of the Philippines had been determined. So here is where the US empire starts after a single war. By the turn of the 20th century, the US had its own overseas empire, but it still wasn't the biggest player on the map. That changed in 1945. After World War II, the old world order lay in ruins. The British and French Empire were technically winners, but they were bankrupt, exhausted, and losing their colonies fast. As the dust settled, only two giants remained: the USSR and the USA. But here is where the US got smart. While the Soviets tried to control land with iron fences and tanks, the United States, satisfied with their extent, decided to build an empire out of something much more invisible: the global financial system. At Bretton Woods Conference, 44 allied nations met at Mount Washington Hotel. At the conference, the US dollar was made the world's main currency. For this, most countries used the gold standard. But after the war, Europe was broke and the US held about 80% of the world's gold. At Bretton Woods, the US essentially made the world an offer they couldn't refuse. The dollar would be the only currency backed by the gold, $35 per ounce, and every other country would peg their currency to the US dollar. linking any country's currency to the US currency. If the dollar crashed, all other currencies are in danger. But remember, the dollar was connected to gold, $35 per ounce. Well, that was until 1971, where President Nixon fully ended the dollar's link to gold internationally. And so, since then, the whole world's economy has been linked to the idea of the United States of America. So, the US has a territorial empire and the World Economical Empire. And that's without mentioning the multiple billion-dollar companies who are based in the USA. However, in the past year, America's ambitions are back. When America became a global superpower after World War II, presidents largely ceased trying to incorporate territory into the country and focused on economic imperialism. However, Trump's attitude on international affairs reminds us a lot on how Britain used to act on the world stage before their empire collapsed. They seem to believe they should be free to remove foreign leaders and dominate foreign land without any regard to national sovereignty and international law, at least according to their actions. In other words, Donald Trump's foreign policy is imperialism. And that was proven on January 2nd, 2026. Venezuela's economy crashed in 2010 amid hyperinflation. Maduro's regime has been characterized by repression and human rights abuse, as he has gone after his political opponents. The mix of Maduro's authoritarian rule, staggering poverty levels, and citizens' limited access to food and other basic necessities have forced an estimated 8 million Venezuelans to leave their country and look for a better living condition elsewhere, according to Human Rights. In the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, the US conducted a military operation across Venezuela, including the capital, Caracas, where Maduro and his wife were staying and were eventually captured. This intervention was illegal. However, Trump did remove a horrible dictator. The problem comes when he, stayed. Right after the strikes, Trump said that the US would run Venezuela until a safe, proper, judicial transition can be ensured.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
It is unclear exactly how long the US will run Venezuela for, but the president said it will be a group of people leading the charge. Later, he uploaded this image. Again, we are speaking about Donald Trump. Not everything he says is logical or has an actual reason behind it, but it is still worrying that he published this image. However little significance it has, he's claiming to be the acting president of Venezuela. Right after he took over Venezuela, he started pointing north, at Greenland. He started claiming that Greenland was extremely necessary for the national security of the United States. His repeated demands to take control of the territory have been rejected by Greenland's leaders and by NATO member Denmark, of which the island is semi-autonomous territory. Greenland is well placed for early warning systems in the event of a missile attack and monitoring vessels in the region. Speaking in Davos, Trump said only the US could protect, develop and improve Greenland. He also argued that the US would claim the island because of its efforts to defend the territory during World War II after Denmark was invaded by Germany. There were major protests against the threats in Greenland and Denmark, with many opposing the idea that Greenland could be sold or controlled by the US under Trump's plan. Trump still hasn't invaded Greenland or succeeded in pushing forward the US ownership, in part because the global focus has shifted to other conflicts like Iran. Iran is the perfect example of the United States' current imperialism. Critics argue that by assassinating the supreme leader and targeting the top tier of the Iranian government, the US isn't just defending itself, it is forcibly removing a sovereign government to install a political vacuum it can then fill with a more compliant or Western-friendly leadership. I won't get too much into the current Irani war as it's still a developing situation at the time of scripting. So, is the US an empire? Yes, and it's quite obvious. Not only do they have overseas territories which follow the description of an empire, but they also currently act like an empire, taking over land, claiming land, and attacking foreign governments to get what they want. Yes, the US is an empire, and in fact, the most powerful empire in the current world.